Thank you for inviting me to talk today about decentralized finance. In particular, I'll talk about the opportunities and the risks. So let me set the stage. And indeed, times have changed. So some of you might remember the CEO of the largest bank in the world making the statement that Bitcoin was a fraud. Indeed, he said that any JP Morgan trader caught trading Bitcoin would be fired for being stupid. Of course, a little difficult to think about an algorithm being a fraud. There's no CEO or board of directors or anything like that. And indeed, times have changed. JP Morgan jumps on the bandwagon, and they are actively trading cryptocurrency. So there was something else that happened this year, and that is the most successful company in the crypto space actually IPO'd. And the IPO was for $85 billion, so Coinbase, which is a centralized exchange that deals with decentralized tokens. So this is actually close to home, given the co-founder of Coinbase is a 2010 Duke graduate, and Duke happened to get in very early. You see some of my students in the audience there. So I actually don't want to talk about Bitcoin. Indeed, I think way too much attention is paid to the price of Bitcoin or Elon Musk tweeting about Dogecoin. So what I want to talk about is something that is, in my opinion, somewhat under the radar screen, and is decentralized finance, or DeFi. So this is the first slide I put up in my course on DeFi. And it's an interesting slide because you've actually, you know all these words, like keeper, hash, mint. But in decentralized finance, all of these words have very special meaning. And that's what I do in my course and indeed in my book. So let me explain what DeFi actually is. And the simplest way to think about DeFi is it allows peers to trade directly amongst themselves through an algorithm. Okay, so that algorithm is known as a smart contract. Okay, so this is fundamentally peer-to-peer. It's trading with an algorithm. Indeed, it's not too hard to imagine in the future that we will be dealing with algorithms, and not just in finance, but decentralized finance in particular. You deal with an algorithm rather than your broker or your bank. You're dealing with an algorithm. Okay, so that's really an important component. And there's many aspects to decentralized finance. So it's not just the trade of, let's say, asset one for asset two, but it also involves savings and lending. So traditional functions that a centralized bank, a commercial bank, would actually undertake. And there's also this aspect of tokenization, which I will talk about a little later. But tokenization is, I think, a very significant innovation. And I believe that everything will be tokenized in the future. So this is a very important part of decentralized finance. So let's start off with the problems that decentralized finance attempts to solve. So this is important for any new innovation to solve problems. So I'm less impressed if the innovation is designed to solve a problem that doesn't exist yet. So decentralized finance actually solves problems that exist today. So let's start with inefficiency. And I show this image of one of the very first Western Union wire transfers. And this is from 1873. And notice it's for $300. But I also want you to notice the fee that was associated with it. And that fee is $9 or 3%. 3% fee? That sound familiar? Today, when you swipe a credit card, 3% fee. So it is remarkable how little has changed in 150 years. And that 300 basis points or 3% is an enormous fee, especially for retailers that operate on razor-thin margins. But this is just an example of inefficiency. For example, the settlement of a stock transaction, so from the execution time for that stock to be in your name is 2 days. That just doesn't make any sense. We've all struggled with the slowness, the insecurity of wire transfers. So decentralized finance offers something completely different. Indeed, in decentralized finance, there's no difference between execution and settlement. It happens simultaneously. So limited access is the second problem. And many know that 1.7 billion people are unbanked in the world today. And that seems completely unacceptable. But there are many more, in my opinion, we don't have hard data on this, that are underbanked. And let me give you an example of what I mean by underbanked. An entrepreneur has got a very exciting idea that promises to return, let's say 24% of return on investment. The entrepreneur needs funding. The entrepreneur's got a bank. They go to the bank and ask for a loan, and they're turned down, even though the banker says, oh, it's a really good idea. But to be honest, I'd rather deal with one larger customer than 100 customers like you. But given you're a customer of the bank and you've got a credit card, what we'll do is we'll increase the credit limit on that credit card so you can take the loan out. We know how that works. That the rate of interest on a credit card loan could be 24%. So what does that mean? It means the project isn't pursued. That's the sort of friction that decentralized finance addresses. So in decentralized finance, it doesn't matter if you're a big player or a small player. Everybody is just a peer. And for our economy in general, we need these projects that have the 24% rate of return. We've been stuck in 2% real GDP growth, Europe 1%, Japan 0%. And in my opinion, substantially contributing to this lethargic growth are all of the financial frictions. We want these projects to be pursued. So when you cut out that middle layer, when you put people directly together, savings rates increase and the lending rates decrease. You don't need to pay for the brick and mortar. You don't need to pay for the back office. The third problem is opacity. And let me start this with a hilarious letter that was sent by Senator Elizabeth Warren to the Treasury Secretary in the summer. And let me actually read from this. Senator Warren says, DeFi refers to a fast-growing and highly opaque corner of the cryptocurrency market. Well, I conclude from this that Senator Warren needs to read my book, number one, or whoever wrote this letter for her, because it's actually the opposite. So decentralized finance is completely open. So these algorithms that you trade with, the smart contracts, they're open source. Anybody can see the code. And anybody can see the balances of the people that you're doing business with. So it is completely transparent. And what is not transparent is our current financial system. Where you put money at a bank, you have no idea what the health of that bank actually is. And indeed, you rely upon the regulators to monitor the health of the bank. And those regulators have a dubious track record. And I'm not talking about the 1930s. I'm talking about something recent, like the global financial crisis. So the fourth issue is centralized control. Our banking system is highly concentrated. not just in the US and many other countries, indeed, some other countries worse than the US. And that means that the savings rates are too low, the borrowing rates are too high, and they're too low and too high because of market power. So think of decentralized finance as creating a much more competitive environment. So we can offer savers a reasonable rate of return. And we can reduce that cost of borrowing and thereby spur investment, employment, and economic growth. So the last is lack of interoperability. So what do I mean by that? Well, a good example is you transferring money from your bank to your broker or from your broker to your bank. That's going to take 2 to 5 days. In DeFi, everything is designed to be interoperable. So if I've got a wallet or a vault on my smartphone or my laptop, and I want to trade with the decentralized exchange, then you just link my wallet in one easy step to that exchange, and I'm ready to go immediately. There's no delay. You're ready to go. So this is a concept that's known as DeFi Legos, where a critical component of this landscape is that the different protocols are interoperable. So those are some of the problems, and the promise is very significant, but with any new innovation, there's going to be risk. And if you want to mitigate all the risk, you might as well just buy treasury bills, and we know what sort of return you get from that. But it's very important, if you're going to be involved in this space, or to assess where this space is actually going, is to understand the different risks. So let me start with smart contract risk. So smart contracts are the algorithms that you interact with on, let's say, the Ethereum blockchain. And I argued that this is a new attack vector. And what do I mean by that? So think of a hacker that wants to break into, let's say, Target, which was done a few years ago. It's really hard to get in. So it's going to take a lot of effort to get in. And then once you're in, you're faced with millions of lines of code that you need to figure out. So with smart contracts, it's the opposite. Given it's open source, you're in, right? And everybody's in. So you've got thousands of potential exploiters looking very carefully at these contracts and trying to find some sort of vulnerability. So this is smart contract risk, and there are firms today that exist with the sole purpose of auditing a potential smart contract before it's actually posted on the Ethereum blockchain. So this is very important. And of course, there's like 2 types of errors, at least 2 types. One is a simple logic error, which could be devastating. And the other is more subtle, and I want to talk about a few examples. So the logic error, think of that as the contract has got a balance of, let's say, 13.9999 Ether. And a command in the contract is to pay out 14. So the command is rounding up the 13.999 to pay 14, but the contract doesn't have 14, and the command fails. Okay, so it's a simple logic error, and indeed, it's a common, unfortunately, logic error that insufficient balance means that the transaction will fail for sure. But economic exploits are much more subtle. And let me give an example of what I mean by this. So suppose that there's a contract that does some exchange, but it relies upon an external price feed. And this is the idea of an oracle. So an oracle gathers information outside of a particular blockchain. So suppose the oracle is pointing at a particular exchange, but that particular exchange is illiquid. So an exploiter could attack that exchange, the illiquid exchange, to manipulate the price then that price goes back to the main contract as the truth, and then the exploiter can actually profit from that price manipulation. Okay, so this is an example of an economic exploit. So these exploits are actually leveraged by a concept that I think is fascinating, indeed, perhaps the most fascinating concept and new idea in decentralized finance. And it's the idea of a flash attack or a flash loan used in an attack. So what do I mean by a flash loan? So again, it's kind of hard to imagine this, but imagine that you could take a loan out with no collateral. The duration of the loan is 0. There's no counterparty or credit risk, and the interest rate is 0. It sounds a little far-fetched, doesn't it? Well, it isn't. And it has to do with the way that these transactions work in decentralized finance. So transaction can have many steps. So think of the first step as borrowing some money. Then you deploy the money. Perhaps you see an arbitrage opportunity. You buy in one exchange, sell on another exchange. And then the last line is you pay the loan back. If any of the steps fail, so for example, you didn't have enough money to pay back the loan, then the entire transaction fails. And we revert to the state before the transaction ever occurred, before you borrowed the money. So in this sense, you don't need collateral. There's no credit risk. The duration is 0 because it happens in one transaction. This is also a really good example of financial democracy. And to really understand this, there was an exploit in the spring of Yearn.finance that used a flash loan and a flash attack. And I'll go through this just in some detail, but I want to emphasize the very first step here, and it is extraordinary. So again, this is a transaction, a complicated transaction, but the very first step is to take out a flash loan. And that loan was for the equivalent at the time of $200 million. Okay, completely uncollateralized. So maybe in traditional finance, a hedge fund could pull something off like that. But for us, there's no chance we could get like an uncollateralized line of credit for $200 million. Yet that's the first step of this transaction. And this is unlikely a hedge fund, but it could be a 15-year-old high school student, and she sees an arbitrage and is able to pull this off. Okay, that is financial democracy. And arbitrage is very easy to do in this particular space. And that's a good thing because it forces the prices to be fair. So this is another exploit that it's kind of an interesting one for many different reasons, but it does demonstrate the smart contract risk. So this just happened a few months ago, and this is basically the largest DeFi exploit in history, where 611 million were drained from Poly network. So what's interesting is that there was an exchange between the exploiter and Poly, and it's very interesting. So let me actually read some of it. So they are asking for the money back, $611 million, and trying to figure out the motivation of the person that did the exploit. So the exploiter says, and the exploiter will be known as Mr. White Hat, and I'll tell you why in a minute. When spotting the bug, I had mixed feelings. Ask yourself, what would you do facing so much fortune? Would you ask the project team politely so that they can fix it? Anyone on the project team could be a traitor given 1 billion. I guess rounding up the 611 million to 1 billion. I can trust nobody. The only solution I can come up with is saving it in a trusted account while keeping myself anonymous and safe. So again, you see the possibility of just draining all this money. It's completely open source. You drain it because if you don't drain it, somebody else is going to do it. In the end, Poly got all of the money back and paid what's known as a bug bounty. And they paid $500,000 to Mr. White Hat. I might have asked for more than $500,000 given the size of the essentially error in their smart contract. But this is the way that it actually works. So not all smart contracts are smart. Indeed, I'm always skeptical of anything with the word smart appended to it. So this is a new space, and the standard for getting it right is very, very high. So number two is governance risk. And what do I mean by that? There are some smart contracts that are deployed that are set in stone. So once it's done, it's done. It just resides in the Ethereum blockchain forever, and people can choose to interact with that contract. But there are other contracts where there are certain key parameters that can be altered by the governance of the protocol. So there'd be a governance token, for instance, and people vote on changes. And it could be a collateralization ratio, it might be a savings rate, it might be some minting of a token. Okay, so again, this is kind of like a new world, and risk is definitely introduced. So I'll give you an example of something that happened this year. This is a stable coin called True Seigniorage Dollar. And the way these protocols usually work is at the beginning, the developers retain control. So it's not really decentralized. And they do that so that they can make fine-tuning changes to the protocol very quickly. But then the governance is distributed to the users. And in this particular case, the developers ended up with only 9% of the governance of the TSD. So an exploiter actually amassed much more than 9% and put forward a proposal. And the proposal was to mint him or herself 11.5 quintillion of these TSDs. And it went through. So immediately, when the exploiter got the coin, they dumped as much as possible on a decentralized exchange and drove the value of TSD to zero. Now, what's interesting in this Twitter thread from TSD is the very last sentence. And they say, well, this is sad. It's an attack, but this is how decentralized finance works. This is a risk, and people will learn from that. So Oracle risk, I've kind of talked about already. Again, the Oracle is a way to bring information into a blockchain from outside. And I've already talked about a price feed that could be manipulated, and that introduces risk. But there's many other types of risks. Like a simple risk is if the Oracle goes down. And we've had oracles go down. And that means that every transaction sent to the smart contract is going to fail. Remember I said that every step needs to work. And the step that uses the oracle, if it doesn't work, then the transaction fails. So for DeFi that operates 24/7, every day of the year, to go down is a big deal. So that's definitely a risk. Let me talk about scaling risk. And this has to do really with the mechanism that's used in Ethereum and in Bitcoin called proof of work. So proof of work is very computationally intensive. And as a result, it really doesn't allow for a lot of transactions per second. Indeed, Ethereum can do about 15 transactions per second, whereas Visa can do 65,000 transactions per second. So it's not really competitive. So something has to change. And this is definitely a risk, but there are many ideas that have been put forward. And the basic key idea is to move Ethereum from this computationally intensive proof of work to a much more computationally efficient proof of stake. So instead of thousands of computers redundantly doing the same thing, it would be literally one computer. And when Ethereum transitions to proof of stake, likely in 2022, this will dramatically increase the number of transactions per second. So other blockchains, and there are a number of DeFi blockchains that are not Ethereum, but they look a lot like Ethereum. Some have already moved to proof of stake, and then some use a different technology that is a little more centralized and called vertical scaling. So Solana or Algorand might have a limited number of machines doing this redundant work rather than thousands of machines. And when you have that centralization, you can actually get much more throughput. So Ethereum has got an idea that's related to this, but minus the centralization. So it is horizontal scaling. So think of actually breaking up the Ethereum blockchain into 64 different chains. And there's a master chain connecting all of them. And this is planned in the second version of Ethereum. And again, likely in 2022 or 23 for this one. And again, this will deliver 50,000 transactions per second just with that. And there are many other proposals, but one that has got some attention these days is layer 2. So the motivational layer 2 is originally to take all the small stuff and make it off-chain in a very efficient way. And what that involves is having an on-chain transaction to a secure space. It could be a multi-signature wallet, where people can securely transact within this wallet at no cost. And then at the end, and it could be after millions of transactions, you write back to the main chain. So there's really only two on-chain transactions: to seed the wallet and then to put the funds back on-chain. And this is layer 2. Indeed, layer 2 got some publicity because this layer 2 can apply to any blockchain, including Bitcoin. And the implementation of Bitcoin in El Salvador uses a layer 2 implementation, so people don't need to pay a $19 transaction fee to buy a cup of coffee. Okay, so again, these risks, in my opinion, they're basically going to be mitigated. So it is true 15 transactions per second is not good enough, but in the future, there's a clear path to actually having very competitive number of transactions per second. So DEX risk. So DEX is decentralized exchange. I want to contrast DEX with, let's say, Coinbase or Binance. Coinbase is a centralized exchange. Binance is centralized exchange. A DEX is a decentralized exchange where you are sending, let's say, asset 1 to an algorithm. The algorithm sends you back asset 2. Interestingly, the algorithm doesn't care if you're a buyer or seller. The algorithm is completely transparent, so you've got a good idea of the price that you're going to get. But this is a new technology. There's issues, very subtle issues with this technology. So some of these algorithms are known as automated market makers, and there are issues in terms of the opportunity lost for liquidity providers. There are other approaches that are order book type of exchanges, some more centralized than others, and issues as to where all of the bid and the offers actually go. So we're working this out. It's new area. It's a great area for research. But right now, again, it is something that I put in my top 10 lists of risk. So custodial risk is another one. And custodial risk is not really new to decentralized finance, but it is different in decentralized finance. So for example, you might have your broker hold your stock in the broker's name. So you don't need to worry about custody, and you don't need to deliver the shares every time you do the trading. So many large investment funds have shied away from actually trading in cryptocurrency because of this custodial problem. So what do I do with my private keys? What if I lose my private keys? Indeed, if you saw this New York Times story, it is very interesting. This is a programmer in California that had private keys, and private keys like 256 bits. So it's a long random number. And they decided that they would do self-custody. So they purchased a hardware wallet and put all their private keys into that wallet. The way the wallet works is it's password protected. But then this person forgot the password. And the hardware wallet's got a special feature that if you miss the password 10 times in a row, then the hardware destroys itself. And that means you can never recover the private keys. This programmer has tried 8 different candidate passwords. Each one has failed. 2 left. And the amount of capital at the time of the story was $220 million. So again, this is a risk. There are solutions out there. So there are companies, just like the broker would have custody of your shares. There are companies that do custody for crypto right now, and that might be Fidelity or Coinbase Pro. So this risk is being mitigated. Nevertheless, it definitely deserves to be on the main list. Environmental risk. This is a big deal. Both Bitcoin and Ethereum use proof of work, which is very energy intensive. Indeed, Bitcoin alone uses as much energy as the country of Argentina. So I say that this is the greatest strength and greatest weakness. And what do I mean by that? It's a strength because anything written on the Bitcoin or Ethereum blockchain is there forever. It's technologically infeasible to mount an attack to change the history. So that's the greatest strength, that you've got a record that can't be altered. Whether it's a government or a hacker, no, it is set in stone. And that's the greatest strength. But it's also a weakness because it causes very slow transactions per second, and it's environmentally reckless. So in DeFi, this is less of an issue than in, let's say, Bitcoin. And let me explain why. So the energy use in Bitcoin is enormous. So I calculate that the marginal cost in carbon for producing a new Bitcoin is $4,000. There's some issues here as to how to deal with that because the coin is traded, so it doesn't make sense to have a tax every single time you transact. And it's also the case that the older Bitcoin, so we have about 18 million right now, but probably the carbon cost of the first 15 million, like less than 10 cents a coin. So there's issues like that. But I think that the key thing for you to realize in decentralized finance, we don't use Bitcoin directly. So we use Ethereum and Ethereum-like protocols. Ethereum's moving to proof of stake. Proof of stake is much more environmentally friendly. So again, instead of having all of this redundant computing going on, you've got like one machine. So the environmental impact of DeFi is will be a fraction of the environmental impact, for example, of Bitcoin. Bitcoin, in my opinion, is not going to change. It just seems very unlikely. But what will happen is that the mining will move to more environmentally friendly places. So we already saw the shutdown of the Chinese mining, which is a great idea. But the mining will likely focus on locked energy, like geothermal, or other energy that's currently wasted, like the flaring for natural gas. So this is definitely a risk, and indeed, some ETFs have already begun offering a product that when you buy into the ETF, you do a carbon offset. Regulatory risk, that's a big one. And indeed, DeFi is in the crosshairs of the SEC. And right now, we're in a limbo. We just don't know what the regulations will be. And it's complicated because the Securities Act of 1933, it didn't mention cryptocurrency. So it's really a challenge. We already saw this year that Coinbase got served because they were going to offer a product with a 4% savings rate. And the SEC said, this sounds like a security. So you need to register. You need to go through a number of steps. And eventually Coinbase withdrew their application. So Coinbase was a target because they are a centralized institution. There is a CEO, a board of directors, and a head office. So they are a centralized financial firm that deals in decentralized finance. So to get that 4% savings rate, we can actually do much better in DeFi. So operating directly, providing liquidity to a smart contract, you can do better. But why does the SEC go after Coinbase? Well, because they're high profile and they're centralized. It's much more problematic to serve an algorithm. How do you do that? And indeed, where do you do it? The algorithm exists on computers across the world, thousands of computers that are running nodes. Even if you shut down all of the nodes within one country, you've got all of the other nodes. And then maybe you think about going after the users, the ones that are actually getting the 5% savings rate. But that doesn't make any sense because the SEC is charged with protecting those users, not punishing them. So it is a real challenge in this space. And think about it this way, that if the SEC does nothing, then there will be the Wild West where people will take advantage of other people. And that's what the SEC wants to prevent. But on the other hand, if you're too harsh, then you will drive the innovation either to zero or to drive it offshore. So a good idea that comes out of your country all of a sudden leaves the country and the country doesn't benefit. So those two extremes are neither is desirable. What you want is something in the middle, but it's really challenging. This is a difficult space to deal with. It is technologically complicated. And then even if you invest the time to understand what's going on, it's changing so rapidly. So you need to invest even more time. Okay, so let me conclude. And this is, I think, an important reflection that I've only recently come to after so many years as a researcher in finance. And that is that our financial system really hasn't changed in the last 100 years. We've got essentially the same commercial banks. Maybe there's been some mergers, some name changes, the same banks, the same stock exchanges, same brokers, same insurance companies, indeed the same central banks using effectively the same architecture, the same infrastructure, yeah, with some digitization, but it's basically the same. Now, we have seen a current wave of fintech that improves the experience. So think of Robinhood. And I argue that this current wave of fintech is likely fleeting. And this is a quote from a guest lecturer in my course, the co-founder of Paradigm and Coinbase. And he says, the current fintech, like Stripe and Plaid, is like putting lipstick on a pig. And what he means is you can only go so far because the current fintech is using the centralized infrastructure. They can reduce costs, but then they hit a barrier. And that's where DeFi kicks in. So today, I believe we're less than 1% into the DeFi disruption. But it's extraordinary today that if you just look at the capitalization of the cryptos, it rivals the capitalization of all global banks today. So let me end with a few things. Number one is a quote from Tim Roughgarden, who teaches a blockchain course at Columbia University. And let me read this. Future generations will be jealous of your opportunity to get in on the ground floor of this new area. Think about that. It is perhaps a multi-generation opportunity to get in at less than 1% of the disruption. And I'm not talking about just buying some cryptocurrency, but getting to know what is happening, perhaps even being associated with a startup in this particular space. So it is an extraordinary opportunity. So for me, I see the scaffolding of a new city. And to be clear, this is not a renovation of the current city. It is a complete rebuild from the bottom up. I believe that the legacy players totally understand that. And they know what's coming. It's just a matter of time. My book begins with the sentence, "We have come full circle." At the beginning of market exchange, it was barter, which was really inefficient. And then we introduced money to make market exchange much more efficient. Well, now, given that we can tokenize almost anything, we've got a much broader definition of money, and we can effectively return to barter in a much more efficient way. The central banks kind of realize this and are trying to push on digital currency, but in my opinion, the horse has left the barn. They've already lost control of what is money. So finally, one last remark. I talked to a number of investors that say, well, we don't really understand the space. We don't have any crypto direct or indirect investments. We are not exposed to this space. And I would argue that that is incorrect. You're exposed in a negative way. This disruption is so severe that it could eliminate the business model of many of the companies that you're already invested in. So I think it's important to take the time to try to understand the space and to understand the vision of the future. A good place to start, my book.